The Owl House ends on one of the most buoyantly optimistic notes I have seen in many of these Western animated shows I've watched. The likes of Gravity Falls and Amphibia are not exactly Tolstoy. They're not exactly Dostoevsky. They don't delve into this liquid grimness that suffuses the darker parts of experience, but they nonetheless have a note of wistfulness and melancholy to them. The Owl House is different. It is ebullient. It is almost frenetically optimistic. It believes in a brighter future. It believes in it for Luce, and it believes in it for the people that she's spent so much time with. And yet the ending isn't saccharine. It mostly works because it refuses to rely on rote sentimentality. The emotional and psychological catharsis that Luce ultimately arrives at feels earned. I talked before about how Belos and the Collector are two different elements of her shadow. In this Jungian sense, the shadow is who we believe we are not. These aspects of ourselves that remain unconscious and that are connected to the vastness and unknowability and ineffability of the world. And we ignore all that because we want to cling to this simplistic, reassuring, lofty idea of who we are. But that idea is oversimplistic. And too often, it is simply the result of rote repetition, the mechanistic going through of habit and routine, and eventually it creates a stale and rigid idea of the self that causes malaise because it's not true. It does not relate wholly to one's experience with the world or with one's own oceanic, tumultuous, tempestuous psyche. Luce must go inward and confront the aspects of herself that she would rather believe do not exist. Not simply to conquer them, but to understand them. To understand that these are elements of herself, that they are not other. They are fundamentally not completely apart from her, despite what she would like to believe, and she must deal with these negative manifestations of her fears and anxieties about herself in a healthy way, and thus reintegrate the shadow into the self and develop a healthier and more robust and broader concept of who she is and how she relates to the world. She starts to see herself as innately connected to these darker parts of herself and to the world in all its strangeness and chaos, while also believing that she can rise above that darkness, that she is not subject to her worst impulses. One thing I really like about the finale is that it demonstrates Luce in this twisted dream of hers, conjured by the Collector, having to confront these dreads about herself. She knows that there is this link between her and Belos, that there is this similarity between her and Belos, and that recognition, while important to the process of delving into the unconscious, delving into these darker, more enigmatic parts of the self, can be devastating. It can swallow up and disintegrate the self and lead to a complete breakdown. But Luce, with the support of all the adventures she's been on, is stronger now. She knows that no, she is not Belos. Yes, she is not a perfect person, but she tries to do what is right. She can be confident in herself without being arrogant or solipsistic as she was in the start of the show, and she is thus able to emerge from this trap, emerge from this unease and malaise, and reaffirm her basic self-concept, reaffirm the sense of herself as a good and just person. It's important to note that the Collector and Belos are not just two separate parts of the shadow, two images of aspects of herself that she would rather not admit at the start of the show. They are, in a way, an important way, opposites. Belos is like her in that he came to this world as a human, as an outsider, and felt a lot of that isolation and loneliness. But ultimately, Belos responded in the most negative and cruel way possible, proving himself unable to rise above his petty prejudices. Luce is different. She does not ignore the similarity between herself and Belos, though she would, at the start of the show, rather cling to this simplistic, reassuring, sentimental idea of herself. And she is able to see that likeness without it destroying her. And she is able to know definitively that she chose not to be that person. The Collector is a bit different. The Collector is quite similar to her at the start of the show, not just the person she could have become, but certain elements of who she actually was. She was naive. She was selfish. She was unwilling to understand the consequences her actions could have on others. She has moved beyond this person. And now, in the Collector, she faces a kind of manifestation of the person she once was. Not that the Collector is exactly the same as her, of course, but the Collector is an embodiment of who she does not want to be anymore, who she knows she has moved past. And yet she is mature enough to know that that was a part of herself. That is not entirely other, that is not entirely separate. That is, in fact, the person that she was, and there's no shame in that. So she is able to extend help to the Collector. This, I think, is an interesting lens through which to view their two separate fates. Belos is the oppositional part of the shadow. He is all of those desires that she needs to cast out of herself. She needs to recognize that she could have been that person, but that's not her. The Collector, meanwhile, is forgiven not just because, narratively speaking, he's not horrible like Belos, and is more capricious and young, very young, at least from our perspective. He very much acts like a child. But because he is a manifestation of these different parts of Luce that she is not necessarily proud of, but she understands was a part of her. She has moved past that stage in her life, but it was a stage in her life. She is able to reintegrate that shadow into herself, to not view it as completely other, as completely alien, but rather as close to who she once was, and she thus provides the Collector help and guidance. The Collector is not done, of course. He has his own adventures to go on, and going on these adventures is important. Otherwise, the Collector will not have the opportunity to grow as Luce did. simply providing instructions morally is not enough. The entire basis of narrative storytelling rests on that idea that simply giving people advice is not sufficient. Simple moral precepts are not sufficient, not because they're bad, but because they're too abstract. Someone needs to learn for themselves and experience for themselves what is right and what is advantageous, and conversely, what is harmful to the self and others through experience. Advice is helpful, but it can't completely take the place of individually voyaging out into the unknown and discovering that one's conception of oneself is not sufficient, that there's so much else out there, and that even in one's own mind there are so many of these wild, dark, uncertain, enigmatic, beautiful impulses that we don't know yet. So the collector is able to grow, and I think that matters. Luce is able to navigate, in Freudian terms, between her id and her superego. The superego is the voice of society, the voice of expectation. For Luce, it is the voice that is telling her to obey convention, to do what is asked of her. The id is her purified, unrelenting desire to chase whatever passions appeal to her. Initially, her passion for being a witch and living in the Boiling Isles. Eventually, she is able to bring these together in a way that is healthy, and in a way that brings about no shame. She is no longer a prisoner of abstract and restrictive social conventions. She has incorporated into herself that which was good about those conventions, the idea that she does need to care about other people instead of just fulfilling whatever crazy thought comes into her head, but she does not allow those conventions to restrict her behavior. So I think on these principles, the finale is largely a success, and it's quite beautiful. I will say that the part where she and the others completely annihilate Belos is something that really should be understood within the context of other children's shows always advocating for complete reconciliation at all costs. The Owl House takes a stand against that. Luce gives the collector generally moral advice about trying to see the good in others, and the collector applies that advice to Belos wrongly. And the result is that Luce gets killed. So, in that context, the show steering a route away from the Steven Universe approach and asserting that there are, in fact, some lines that do need to be crossed in terms of violence makes sense. Outside that context, it's just a bit strange and somewhat mean-spirited. Not that she should be nice to Belos, who is in the show completely 100% horrible, but just that it seems a bit of an odd note for such an optimistic episode, unless you understand the context in which the show is working vis-a-vis other kids' programming. But on the whole, I liked it. Solid, optimistic ending. The future is bright for Luce. I personally might have wanted a little more melancholy in the ending, but that's just my personal tastes. The catharsis that Luce arrives at here feels fundamentally justified. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this. I have absolutely adored spending all of this time with y'all these last few years talking about the Owl House. It's a shame that's come to an end. I must admit, I would have preferred to keep talking with you about this show. But y'all, that is the nature of things. Every stage in life comes to an end. Luce understands that, I think. And so, of course, should we all. Adios, comrades.